So before we touch any code or even open the Unreal Engine, the first thing to do is ensure that everyone has an understanding of the concepts and terminologies that will be used throughout the duration of the course. We'll also be looking at some of the considerations that should be kept in mind when working with components and balancing their use in your own projects. So some of this may already be familiar to people experienced with the engine, but we'll also be going through some of the lesser discussed topics. So I hope that this brief overview will provide something new for any developers. To begin, we're just going to look at the main type of components that you'll see fairly often throughout the engine and specifically in this course as well. So the first one, as pretty much with anything in the standard kind of class hierarchy, we have the actor component. Of course, in the standard class hierarchy, there's one above this, which would be the object class. But in a very similar way, this is the base class for components. We can define in here our reusable behavior, and this can be added to different types of actors. Next, we'll have our scene component. Now, these are basically actor components that have a transform, so this can be a little bit confusing as the actor classes inside of Unreal, of course, have the implementation of transforms as well. Of course, you can place your transform in the world. In a similar way, the scene is that version of a component which has a transform, so you can place it somewhere specifically inside of your blueprint. And it also has the capability of having another component attached to it, which actor components do not allow. And then we won't be touching this one directly in the course, but this is another very useful one to know a little bit about, and that is the primitive component. So where the scene component implements the concept of transforms, also things like collision capabilities, the primitive component is just a scene component that contains or generates a kind of geometry. So you've probably seen these a lot of times implemented in some of the default classes and just may not have considered exactly what it is that you're using. With Unreal being quite as big as it is, these of course are not the only components in the engine. By no means, if we look at just some of these are even cut off, but if we just look for the component classes that are already available to inherit from, we have a long list of different things that we can already implement and use within our own projects. So you can see here just in this bit that even though that's being cut off, there's already a lot of things which just inherit directly from the actor component alone. And again, looking at some of these, you may have already used some of them or implemented them in your own projects. Now again, before diving straight into anything, there's also some considerations to take with the components that we'll be working with. Although they can be super useful and they can definitely improve the workflow in a lot of different projects, it's also important to stress that this course is not intended to say that it is the best or only way that projects should be approached, as there are some drawbacks and costs when implementing the components. So for the positives, they are generally lighter than the counterpart, so the A-actor component versus the A-actor. The A-actor has a lot of things if you look in the code going on, including a lot of networking and replication calls going. So if you were considering creating separate actor classes just to house certain logic and kind of reuse that, in many cases it will be cheaper to actually do that same logic in the actor component and reuse that instead. However, saying that, as with anything else which is loaded, this will incur memory costs when these are being loaded in. So any class which is housing your actor components, your scene components, anything like that, will have that extra loading cost when you are opening your level, transitioning between maps, or spawning in new actors with those components attached. In a similar way, they also house some potential runtime implications. You always need to remember that by default, as with most actors, unless you've turned it off in your project, then you will have the update or tick functions set to be active by default. So again, the more components that you have on any one class and the more of those classes that you have in memory at runtime will all start adding up. Now, this isn't to scare you away. It's going to take a lot of kind of abuse to really make this a problem. But like I said, it's just to make sure that we don't start looking at this as the only or best way to always go forward regardless. As with anything, when programming, there will always be considerations to take into account and kind of balance the best end performance. So just as an example, very quickly, of some of the basic code you'd see in a very standard component, just to really kind of reinforce the kind of things that are happening behind the scenes, especially if you're only familiar with some blueprinting in the past. So to begin with, this is a scene component, which if we were to jump into this class would obviously be inheriting from the actor component. So this is going to be doing all of those function calls from the parent as well. This will include things like a call as well to the constructor. So as with any other C++ class, we'll be doing our variable settings and default property updates here in the constructor. We then have a call to the begin play. You can see this as an override. So again, we'll be accessing our parents begin play function. So all of these again, we'll be doing this when the level is loaded per component. So again, these are the kind of things that you want to keep in check. And then as we can see down here, we have the override call to the tick component as well. This is the component version of the tick event, which is the tick component, very similar though. And again, this is an override. So all of this will be calling the parent component and so on. And I've highlighted these functions because the constructor, begin play, and tick component are all default. I've not added these, so anytime you create one of these components, all of this will be included by default unless you come in and start removing things and customizing it to your needs. So you now know some of the distinctions between the different components that we'll be working with, some of the things to consider when working with those components in your own projects, and just some of the ways that you may already find that you've been working with some of these default components in your own projects.